everyone.
What if I looked over your shoulder and I just read your...
Thank you for coming to our panel. My name is Marie Sneed, and I'm the moderator for this group, and I'm going to try to keep this group under control. But those of you who know them know that will be difficult, and I've gotten to meet them, and we've had calls. It's like, it is going to be difficult to do it. We have now 38 minutes and a little more than 38 minutes. It's a hard stop at 40. We're not doing introductions and we're not taking questions, but we hope that you will be stimulated by the discussion. And Ben's going to start out by answering the first question. He wasn't able to join us for breakfast, and so the group nominated him to answer this question. So you can tell what kind of group we are. And he's like, what? So the topic for this panel is TrumpED, how is policy in a divided government shaping higher education innovation? So Ben, what do you think TrumpED means to you?
I thought it was trumped. I read it wrong. This is a tough one. I'm not really sure what that means. We put it in our newsletter, and people emailed me, and they said, TrumpED, we love your marketing. And of course, Deborah and the team made it up. I'll go with trumped. I think oftentimes there's a big gap between what we read and hear about what's happening in the world of public policy, particularly as it relates to education, and what's actually happening. I think the negotiated rulemaking which we'll talk about in a bit, is an interesting example, because most commentators, with the exception of a handful of journalists, I think don't tend to follow what's happening, and so they have very few data points, and so they work to make sense of what's happening in the field from just a few snippets, as opposed to something that reflects more of a progression. So I see Jamie Studley in the room, and I think when you look at what's happening right now, for example, around accreditation, there are all sorts of pockets of innovation, and I think the trend lines tend to look much more linear than we often give them credit for.
Alana, do you have any thoughts about what that means to you?
I think that's totally right, that there is, I hate to say this because I worry that I'll get eggs thrown at me, but I think the headlines of what this administration is doing are pretty terrible. Some of the boring mechanics are not as bad. So I think, and I think the spirit of what this administration would like to do in higher ed, which is unlock innovation, bring down costs, make it more accessible, I think that's a good thing. I think the question is, how do you get there while also having a market that provides a respectable level of consumer protection?
Tony, I'm going to let you kick us off with our question about the college admissions scandal, and let me just lay it a predicate for it. In the wake of the college admissions scandal, what are the implications for higher education institutions in addressing the admission process? And a second part of that is, how can higher education institutions use this as an opportunity to address equitable access?
Well, I think it's topical, and I can't tell you how many cocktail conversations I've had about the college admission scandal. I think the reality is it disproportionately impacts, candidly, folks like us in this room and our children, and that it really isn't an issue of access at that level. I think college admissions, especially at selective institutions, has never been equitable. And if you just look at the sheer numbers, even with this, at the scale of this, unfortunately, they're not really, those positions that they took, right, through fraud and misrepresentation, weren't ultimately going to generally people of a much lower socioeconomic and the non-traditional student. And so I think it's an abuse at the extreme of using wealth and influence and an admission process that is not very transparent. And I think that's where it has people aghast. But the correlation between college entrance exams on the ACT and SAT is highly correlated to socioeconomic status. And so you're going to see then, that's the case, the ability to influence that, provide more resources. To the degree that the challenges, court challenges on how do you think about holistic admission standards, right, is a challenge to this notion of it should be completely meritocratic. So there's mixed signals right now in the marketplace. I think it's an opportunity for higher ed to examine and make more transparent, right, the actual admissions process. And I think so consumers can better navigate it. But I don't think it's a good case study for the equitable access problem. I think that's a different challenge.
Martha, where do you come out?
I mean, I agree. I think of this sort of triangle of merit, need, and privilege. So just think of those three parts of a triangle, isosceles triangle, right? Upside down, where the privilege part is the part that was abused, obviously. But then if you step back and look at all of higher education, it's less than 5% of colleges and universities. What can universities do? They can partner with community colleges and K-12 in much better ways. I don't know why we don't have middle schools, for example. We've got such a great track record across the country. Lots of research, it doesn't get applied. And then from an equity standpoint, I was looking at Yale. They gave $50 million to produce more diversity at Yale in 2015. And so what's happened? You have 13 very diverse faculty in the race, ethnicity, and income department at Yale with no new faculty. So, we want to make changes. We want students to have the role models and the mentors and the leadership to diversify institutions. You got to do faculty and students, and that's what they should be doing.
Ben, you want to struggle with this topic?
I was surprised in a way that it generated the attention that it did. It was sort of salacious. Like, that was what drew attention. But, like, shocker, like, rich white people are leveraging their personal resources to get their kids into college. Like, that's not news, right? And I think when you look at legacy admissions, when you look at the lengths that post-secondary institutions will go to attract full tuition paying students, that even state flagship institutions go through to attract full tuition paying students in ways that I think disadvantage or at least are inconsistent with their historic mission. There are real challenges. When you look at the extent to which the entire K-12 infrastructure, which is really sort of content-oriented, systematically disadvantages kids who are from lower income communities in ways that decrease the odds of not only succeeding K-12 education, but bridging the gap into post-secondary education. There are much more interesting and profound issues at play there. And to a certain extent, I think for all of us, maybe it was disappointing that those issues didn't get more play in the context of the reporting.
Alana, what's your view about how to deal with the challenges raised by the scandal?
I think it's the question of, like, what is the challenge raised by the scandal? Because I think, Ben, sort of what you're saying is there are a lot of legal ways to buy your way into college. And so in a sense, I think the fact that people resorted to these measures is sort of the surprising piece. In terms of the equity issue, I think, we have to recognize we have sort of a two-tier system of higher education in this country. There's an elite system that was designed to serve the elite, and that's what it does, and that's what it innovates against. And then there's a system that's designed to serve everyone else, and that system doesn't have as nearly as strong of outcomes. So I think, if we want schools to be at the elite, to be more meritocratic, we have to deal with legacy admissions, donations to the general fund. Are you accepting more lacrosse players than you are basketball players, et cetera? So I think there's a whole range of issues there for elite schools to take on. But candidly, I'm more interested in how do we make the system that serves most of the students in this country more affordable and higher quality.
Well, let's turn then to something that's been part of the political arena, the suggestion that there should be free college for all. what is your view about whether this will get any traction, and how might the proposal stimulate innovation in higher education? And Martha, I'd like you to start with that one.
Sure, just to a little bit of data. There are more than 300 cities and towns across America, from Sauk Valley Community College in Illinois all the way to Shasta College up in Northern California, to Los Angeles, to Dallas, to Boston. So more than 300 communities are already doing this in their own ways. There's no system yet. There's no design. Maybe there shouldn't be a system. Maybe we should just let them innovate and figure out how to do public-private partnerships. There are tons of examples now of amazing public-private partnerships that are actually putting the resources into endowments and protecting them from the political winds that ebb and flow. And by the same token, because there's so much momentum, we went from Tennessee Promise to 23 states, now 24 actually, with West Virginia joining on last week, all different. So if you look at that triangle of merit and need, forget about privilege. This is about the top 100%. The innovation is a real opportunity for us, looking at, what are the perfect designs that are going to drive the outcomes that Alana talked about.
Tony, do you want to jump in on, I heard you might not be in favor of free access. Just kidding.
No, I think access, ensuring equitable access to our higher education system at a time when the need for post-secondary education has never been greater, even if what that means is changing, informed by changing needs in the marketplace. That said, I would say a bigger problem right now is the notion of poor completion rates. With a 15%, 58% kind of completion rate of the traditional 4-year, the issue, I would argue, is less about access for many of the disadvantaged. It's that even when you do participate in the education system, you're actually not actually getting the benefits that it's designed to deliver. And I think if you think about state and federal resources, that's a much bigger need in the current situation. And so if you could provide incentives to actually reward institutions that actually drive people to completion and to with relevant degrees of knowledge, that would be a better return. So less about, do I think ensuring affordable access is important? Of course it is. And so to the degree there's innovation happening around the country, who could be against that? So it's not about, I think, providing access is good, but if I have to make a trade-off, and oftentimes you do in terms of allocating public resources, I'd much rather see innovation towards really driving the persistency problem and the completion problem, especially at the scale that we need it in the country.
Alana, do you agree?
I totally agree with what Tony said. I think if you look at, I think the numbers are 11% completion rates over 6 years for students who receive Pell. So I'm concerned about getting people to college, but I'm probably more concerned about getting people through college. I also think there's this issue of, if the business model of college is broken, does subsidizing it solve the problem? And so for students, again, that Pell student already has a lot of college tuition subsidized, right, through federal aid programs. But what they don't have covered is the cost of their real life. So leaving the higher education system unchanged and providing a little more money to help them get there, I don't know if that changes the dynamic. I think if you were innovating around how do we make college faster? Could we do it in 3 years instead of 4? There's a lot less chance for life to get in the way. Could we create better pathways for folks so they're spending less time wasting credits in transfer process, wasting credits changing their major? Could we work? So I think there are a lot of ways to make college better and more affordable. And I definitely free college has a lot of traction. Certainly it's like all 38 Democratic candidates have it as their higher education policy. But I think there's this chance of what are the other innovation opportunities that are sort of under the hood besides just who pays?
So Ben, you want to?
It's important to say though, there's nothing free. Free equals paid for. And so it's paid for in some way, but what's really interesting is the ways that people are coming together in business, education, government, and philanthropy to figure that out, and also have progression criteria so that the completion, we wrote a paper called Promise with a Purpose.
Yeah.
There's, I don't even think of completion as completing college. I think of having a complete life because college is one other step to more learning. So,
good.
I just think we have to think more deeply about it.
Right, it's not really free. So we want to play devil's advocate or add anything, Ben?
No, I think this is I think it's in some ways kind of a boring conversation, right? Like if you think that education and training
Whose idea was this question?
no, but I think if you think education and training are a lever for social and economic mobility in a democracy, right? Like, who disagrees with that? Like, raise your hand, right? Then like, we should be very concerned about rationing, and like personal wherewithal shouldn't be a barrier to access. But I think the question which we're sort of getting at is like, access to what, right? Like, because we don't believe that post-secondary education has inherent value. It has psychic value. It has it helps to avert stigma in certain cases. It factors very heavily into the hiring criteria that most employers use in this country. But to me, again, there's this issue of like access to what, and I think that's what we're really getting at. And to me, that is a question that there isn't really a great answer to, and for which which is surrounded by still a tremendous amount of debate.
And I just add
I think it was a great question, by the way.
kind of just related to the topic more broadly. And I think, many of us are, and I'm sure folks in the room are well aware. But I think the other thing is oftentimes we think about our post-secondary system in the context of our high school leavers. And that's not, arguably, that is a challenge. But we've got 37 million Americans with some college but not completing. We have a huge young and working adult population that needs access to post-secondary. So we need to think about it holistically, like who is the student that we're trying to serve in terms of when we think about access and we think about completion.
Yeah, let's shift, because I know this is an interest that Ben has when I talk to his team. There's an increasing discussion about the intersection of higher ed and work, and we've touched on it a little bit. What do you see the administrator's priorities be regarding higher ed and work, and how is this playing out in the higher education landscape?
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure it's the administration's priority. I think this, to the extent that this event over the last decade is a proxy for like where there's enthusiasm among investors, both grant makers and private equity and venture investors, there's been a profound shift toward the intersection of education and employment. And to me, that reflects a recognition that we can't, if NCLB was the high watermark of the standards and assessment era, like we spent a lot of time at post-Brown through the war on poverty, sort of normalizing funding, instrumenting a system of K-12 education with the expectation that would improve outcomes meaning social and economic mobility as a result of education. We shifted in the Obama era toward college access and completion. We had the sort of race to the bottom, which led to race to the top, which led to an emphasis on college access and completion. And now we are increasingly questioning the utility of those credentials in the world of work, which is shining a light on the intersection of education and employment. So I don't know that that's the administration's priority, but it feels like very much the focal point of the education discourse today.
Other panel members?
I think it's probably an interesting discussion if you're on Trump's team, because I think the Trump campaign appeal, right, was like trade, the wall, and jobs. And how do you help people who have been displaced by all the kind of technological and geopolitical change of the last several decades? How do you help them get jobs? A big issue for the Trump team is that reskilling does not poll very well. The coal miner wants to hear that you're going to bring coal back. They don't want to hear that they have to learn how to code. So I think there's a challenge there where they know that this is sort of their market, but how do you sort of connect that market with policy is a tough marketing challenge. So they've paid some lip service to apprenticeships. There's nothing scalable or significant coming out of the administration. I do think there's big opportunity there. I think Anthony Carnevale at the Georgetown Center for Education and the Workforce has pointed out that we spend $500 billion on education in the form of college, and we spend something like $8 billion on training. So There's clearly more that we can do, and if you sort of line us up with the rest of the developed world, European countries, et cetera, we're clearly toward the bottom in terms of that balance of what we spend on training versus education. So there's plenty of sort of blue ocean space there for us to develop policy that helps move people into jobs. But I think this administration, as much as they would like probably to figure out a way to talk about it, hasn't figured out a way to hit home with it yet.
Yeah.
Tony, Martha?
Yeah, and I think it's because it's really hard, especially in the kind of the U.S. kind of legislative and policymaking context. So, at the end of the day, I think the connection to jobs really has to be driven by the employers, and the employers at scale have been slow to really embrace, if you will, standards in terms of jobs, competency, skills. It's a very near term, here's what I need in these next 6 months. You can't gear a training and education system to optimize around 6 months job needs. And so when you look at this from a policy standpoint, and you often look at Europe, in Germany and the apprenticeship model, there's a new kind of apprenticeship system being rolled out in the UK. At its foundation is a tax levy to business, which provides a real financial, a set of resources and an incentive to really work on these kinds of programs. And so, the idea that, in the U.S., let alone in the Trump administration, there's going to be a tax increase to fund that, I think that's a non-starter. And so I think structurally, you're really limited to how do you actually bring employer kind of collaboration at scale that can then be used to inform the system. I think that's a big challenge. That's one. Two, I think many would say the post-secondary system is not designed to prepare people for jobs. It's to prepare a more holistic kind of society. So to think that they have the inherent skills that are going to naturally create people who have specific, employer skills, I don't think is practical either. So you need some kind of bridging mechanism. And then I think specifically in that context in the Department of Ed, the reality is the mechanisms, largely through Pell, federal student aid, they're geared with a certain purpose. And, we could talk about boot camps and these kinds of things. The reality is they're not a substitute for a college degree today. Employers haven't treated them that way. In the current labor market, it's highly correlated, right, with, these professional certifications, boot camp, these credentials with people who already have degrees. So they're not really a substitute. And so it doesn't really change the dynamic, the labor market dynamic of, can you actually provide federal resources to an underserved population to get them the requisite skills? They're not going to see those translate unless it's also right now bundled with a degree. So there's just a lot of dynamics that I truly think constrains a Trump administration, but any administration, and I think it's going to be a constraint.
It's kind of about our value system in a way. Martha?
Yeah, I think the one thing the Trump administration could do is to marry a data system between education and labor and social services and health, because we have so many students who love single stop because it's an aggregator. So when a student comes to campus, here are the federal resources that you qualify for if you do. And if you don't, here are pathways into our institution to help you get what you need, for better or worse. It's varied all across the country, obviously by institution, by community, and by support. So I think if they want to do something meaningful in the next couple years, year and a half, they could really incentivize that data system so that we could really learn from it. Where are we losing students? And I don't think any of us really realize the impact of work on the lives of our students in high school and college. I just don't think we have a mindset for that. It's either college and you're a traditional student, or you're not, or you're a working student. And what's happened today is that of our millions and millions of undergraduates, more than half are working and 25% are parents. So just add it up. How are we going to get students through with those completion rates that are 11% of Pell eligible? The corporate sector could play a major role in this, and I think innovation is really critical.
The one thing I just push on a little bit is this notion that the coal miner wants coal back and they don't want to learn to code. That's inconsistent with the Strata Gallup data and others. They don't like the educational options they're being presented with. It's not that. I think that's. I don't think people don't want to upskill. If you look at it's highly variable across states. Also, if you look at that Strata Gallup data, but there's an appetite for skills as a pathway to jobs, there's skepticism about the extent to which the available options, education and training options, translate into jobs.
But if you don't have high-speed internet and you're in a coal mining community that doesn't have broadband, you can't even access the online opportunities.
I take this class and then what?
Right. And can I get there?
Right.
Lots of things to unpack there if we had a lot more time, but I'm going to move on to something that may seem a little more controversial, and that given that the administration is rolling back many of the Obama-era regulations in terms of active enforcement, and the states, there was a recent article in the Post, the states are stepping up their role in higher education. What is or should be the role of the states in higher education, particularly in regulating and encouraging innovation, and state legislative efforts focusing on institution eligibility and state authorization? Who wants to start on that one?
Well, I'm happy to.
Go for it.
Having both.
I know, you guys were.
We've been part of a regulatory regime at the federal level, and candidly, being on a board of an operating entity that operates across states. I understand the frustration, right, that many of us had with kind of the rollback of federal policy of an administration that we thought was kind of well-intentioned, even if people could argue that it was flawed in some aspect or another. Personally, I think it's the wrong direction to move to a federated 50-state model of state regulations. I think in an environment where you're trying to drive innovation, you're trying to leverage technologies that allow you to do things at scale across geographic borders, I think having states define different outcomes, regulatory, if you will, authorities, impacting a federal model of education in terms of federal funding, I think is just operationally challenged. And so while frustrating, I think I can't philosophically support that. And I actually think it's going to be at the expense of added costs and ultimately added cost to the consumer. So I'm not sure there's a net benefit. I think the real issue is you have a divided Congress, which represents a divided people, and that we really need to harmonize and say what is the right education policy at the federal level with respect to federal resources. And that's the problem to solve. And to kind of try to work something out that will likely get challenged in the courts, I think is a satisfying, it feels good, but I don't think it's a practical solution to the problem.
Who else wants to take that on?
I'd say, if you look at if you look at the Strata Gallup data, if you look at data from LinkedIn or MZ, the state and local labor markets are highly variable, right? Like there is no single skills gap. There are a multiplicity of skills gaps, and they look very, very different. States are, I think, oftentimes the forgotten member of the triad, right? And governors are politically accountable. They're oftentimes very closely attuned to the economic priorities of their states, and so I would agree. I think there's a real risk in there's a risk in sort of legislating or regulating in ways that sort of assume that labor market demand is more monolithic than it is, and I think the role of states in sort of ensuring equality and sort of promoting accountability in post-secondary ed is often overlooked.
So Martha.
I think, first, we have an accreditation system to try to get at quality. I think a role could be played for multiple accreditation systems to actually produce more confidence in the quality of places around the country that we call higher education institutions. So we've been thinking about, okay, you win a Baldrige Award. That means you did something for those students and you have good outcomes. Or you're part of the 100 schools that were selected to even be in the cohort for the Aspen Prize. So ways to aggregate quality across the country for the purpose of students knowing where they can go. I think we said know where to go. And then the second thing is the administration is abrogating its responsibility for consumer protection. So we have shameful examples of student loans not being paid back. And I can give you a long list, it would be too long. And so I do think the federal government has a role in protecting students from precarious, predatory behaviors. And I'm not saying, and they can exist anywhere in the system, right? And so if you throw out those regulations, without improving what could be possible, I think it's a missed opportunity. And for states, I think the last thing I'd say is states should be protecting consumers. That's what governors have to do. That's what states are responsible to do. Better if they can join with the federal government, leverage the accountability systems we have, make changes where we need to, and move forward. But I'm really worried about the student protections. I think it's just a free-for-all. We're going to have a lot of variation in states. But the other thing about states is states that do a good job in things, we replicate in other states. So that's the opportunity, I think, in the short term. In the long term, we've got to get back some kind of coordination in the divided Congress.
Alana?
Well, I think I've never taken a Policy 101 class, but I think if you did take a Policy 101 class, I hope that one of the things you would learn is you can't just pour money into an industry and not regulate it. So do you learn that in Policy 101? I don't know. So I think to the extent that we're going to have federal subsidy, and I think we are going to have federal subsidy in higher education, we need to sort of have federal regulation around who meets a minimum standard of quality to access that money. Which institutions aren't providing the outcomes that we should reasonably expect as students, as parents, as taxpayers. So you're sort of cut off from the spigot. I think on the one hand, we need to have this minimum standard. On the other hand, it is totally unclear if you are a school, especially if you're a school that's trying to operate at a national level in all 50 states, right, a lot of the more innovative models, it is totally unclear, right, whether you've met the regulatory burden or not. And I think WGU is like an interesting example of this, where they are producing great outcomes for students. Their accreditor approves of their instructional model, but the department steps in and says they don't. We can't have, we already have a lot of unpredictability around what the department is going to say. We have unpredictability around what accreditors are going to say, this accreditor versus that accreditor, the same accreditor at different points of time. If we then move into a system where we're really putting the consumer protection ball in the hands of states, and so we have 50 different states that we don't know what they're going to say, that's crazy. That's not an environment in which you can have kind of coherent innovation around. So I think ideally you would have good regulation, good clear regulation coming out of the Department of Education. I think that's sort of like what would be best for everyone. I think SARA is an interesting alternative model where, if you do sort of have this kind of regulatory void at the federal level, can you get 50 states or 49 states to cooperate together to kind of create a common sense rule of the road for higher education? I think that's an interesting alternative approach. But again, going back to that Policy 101, there should be outcome-based rules of the road for spitting out a ton of subsidy to an industry.
Well,
And I think that's the key, because I think higher ed has not embraced this notion of what is outcome, right? What is the notion of a quality outcome? And oftentimes it's right, cohort default rate, right, which I'm not sure is the best definition of a quality outcome. And candidly, I would say, and it's very sensitive to me, I also think you need to think about quality outcomes on a risk-adjusted basis.
Yep.
I mean, the reality is we've got a very diverse student population with different risk factors, and we need to create more awareness of and incentives for those to really drive innovation and serve many of these same Pell eligible. The reality is they do
They need more support.
progress and persist at a lower rate. They need more wraparound services. They may not always come into the system with the same level of academic preparedness, right? We know that. And so it's naive to think then that if an institution is delivering against that in an open access situation, that you want to have create an incentive for both progress and absolute performance. And I think our higher education, if you will, regulatory regime on outcomes doesn't address that. And that really should be our primary focus.
So Ben, it looks like your wheels are running over here. Do you want to add anything before I start our lightning round?
No, I think we're hitting on this theme again of access to what, and it's interesting if you look at what happened with the negotiated rulemaking and the changes around regular and substantive. I think back, to was it like 2005 when we lifted I didn't do it, but lifted the 50% rule, which with respect to online learning, like that was this arbitrary rule, right? I don't think it was a particularly thoughtful regulatory mechanism. On the other hand, like lifting that rule in the absence of some measures of quality was probably equally silly, right? And so again, we're getting at this issue of access to what, which is really just a proxy for talking about how we measure outcomes.
Okay, we're starting our lightning round because we have 4 minutes and 26 seconds. And
Lightning.
the question is, you'll love
Exciting.
this. Last week, the negotiated rulemaking committee reached agreement on draft rules that Secretary DeVos stated that, quote, recognize that higher ed has changed in many ways since the last reauthorization of Higher Education Act, including the use of innovative technologies, close quote. In Congress, there are signs that there may be progress in the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. What are your predictions regarding what will happen regarding the draft rules and the reauthorization? Lightning round. Ben?
I don't expect reauthorization happens anytime soon, which I have mixed feelings about. On the one hand, there's tremendous dynamism in the space right now, and so it feels like an opportunity to let things roll. On the other hand, I think I share your concerns about about consumer protections and the absence of real clear guideposts, which I think will come back and bite us.
Martha?
Yeah, I agree with Ben. I think it's, I can't see the higher ed passing until after the election, because there are just too many uncertainties and too much lack of really understanding the challenges and the role of the federal government now that we've swung this way from that way. So I'm not hopeful. I do think there'll be some small wins, and hopefully there'll be some small improvements.
Tony, your predictions?
I don't think it will happen, and I'd say for two primary reasons. The first reason is I think there will actually there's an incentive. I think we know in the Senate and Lamar Alexander staff, they would love to get some kind of bill done, right, and are willing to kind of move their coalitions to some compromise positions. I actually think it will be the Democrats who will believe that their long-term gains are only better, and so they will hold out for a set of policy conditions and not want to compromise. And so the question will be how far. And I think there's a dynamic there that will prove to be difficult. I think the second is, as someone once said, here's what, to grease the skid on a reauthorization, money helps. And so you need to be able to provide enough cost saves so that you can then redistribute some of those savings to different constituencies to get the vote. So it gets very technical and very practical, and it's not quite clear, right, where the savings are going to come in a very practical sense. And so then that, I think it leads, those two dimensions make me less optimistic that something's going to happen in the near term.
Alana?
I don't have a dissenting view in terms of, I don't think we'll see a reauthorization in the next 2 years. Ideally, we would, right? Ideally, we would have sort of, the distance education language still references like microwave transmission, right? Like ideally, we would update our regulatory, our legal and regulatory framework here. But I do think it's a good thing, right, that we didn't see an HEA reauthorization when Virginia Fox was chair, right? Because I think this data point that Martha's bringing up is really important. We never would have seen that under her leadership, some movement on that. So in some ways, I feel like this is maybe the wrong environment to do HEA, although I do think it's like to really harness and scale some of the energy and ideas that come out of a room like this or a conference like this. Rules of the road would be nice, right?
Okay, we have 30 seconds. My panel members, anyone want to add anything in our lightning round?
Yeah, I'll say something, only because the one thing I would say is, and I could say this from the Obama administration, having worked, I think the future, especially, it's got to be driven more towards a future regime that is kind of recognizing and rewarding innovation. And I think that's hard to do. And so we used to say, it's as much about kind of the incentive and the carrot versus the stick. And so while I think safeguards is the lowest common denominator, we've got to prevent active and bad behaviors and protect federal resources. I think that primary legislative approach, if that's what it's optimized, we're not going to then mobilize the system to really meet the needs of the next generation.
Please thank my panelists. I think they were terrific. Very, very insightful. Thank you.